So good. I mean, Brad, the music videos that Brad and the band you guys did was always so amazing and so awesome. But isn't it nice to be live music and be present with live music? It really is. And I think what's really fun to watch our singers and our band is they get it. You know, that's what's so cool about watching this group sing and participate in this community is they get it too. You know, the context of what we might have used to thought of as secular music, and yet how it speaks to the ground of our being, how it speaks to the divine in our midst, how it speaks to just the interconnectedness of God in all things. They get it. It's so much fun to watch that. And so I appreciate their presence here. And also I want to say I appreciate also Xavier and Ed in the back and Parker here on the camera. And just everyone, Avenel, Avenel Harris and Wesley. Wesley passed out all the cards. We appreciate that now that we're getting back to that thing. And Avenel brought cookies and is bringing refreshments, and I'm bringing coffee, and we're going to continue to kind of offer that kind of hospitality. Hopefully, y'all will enjoy this, the coffee. And so many people to thank as well over there in the main church with the technology. So it's just so nice that we have everybody working to make this happen. Even when sometimes it doesn't happen, we're still grateful that that's happening. So I'm doing a series, and I'm finishing it up, and I'm looking for some place to put this coffee, and I don't see it, so I'm going to put it right here. There we go. So I'm finishing up this series that I called 11:11 in 5.5 movements. And I'm just going to recap them very quickly. I'm sure you remember them and had them memorized. The first one is the welcome and inclusiveness of this community. These are sort of core values, kind of core sort of practices that represent who we are in 11:11. So the welcomeness, the inclusiveness. And keep in mind that when I talk about how we do worship in here, worship is not worshiping something out beyond. Worship is the invitation to participate in God's being in the world. So worship is not something other than what we do. Worship is how we do life every day, how we participate in this kind of reality every day. So when we're talking about our core value, welcome and inclusiveness, we're really talking about how we respond with invitation in all of our encounters, which is really hard to do. Next one. Questioning. So one of the first movements was welcoming inclusiveness. Come, whoever you are. Second one was questioning. We question the answers. It's one of our sort of taglines in here. We sort of look for that openness of space of understanding. So we question, we are inquiring. And then the third one was how we reframe this story, right? We recognize that our reality has been a part of the story of separation. That's been kind of who we have been as a human species. That's especially our Western understanding, that it's you and me, they and we, black and white, binary. Everything is understood in terms of separateness, competitiveness. But we see where that's gotten us in the world, right? We also see where that's not just economically with inequality and unequal access to so much in life and inequality of our social living and culture, but it's also, you can see it in creation itself. You can see how that orientation to creation itself, to the environment, us and it, has created such a devastating reality. So we rethink of our story not as separation, but a story of interconnectedness, that we are all one, that we are all interconnected. Then talked about gratitude as a fourth one. Gratitude is our, not just that we're thankful, but there's a way of reframing our moments because we understand that all moments are redemptive. We understand that all moments are restorative. We understand that we share the ground of being with others, even in those difficult moments, even in our difficult moments. So we have gratitude as a way of being that opens up us to see something else there. And that's hard, but that's who we are, I think. So then we had the fifth one last week, which was kairos and mindfulness, how we practice this kind of awareness and being present in all moments. And today is the half, my favorite, the one half. And the one half is really about what I'm calling Jesus as the yes and. Jesus is God's yes and. It's interesting, 2 Corinthians 1:20. I didn't know this. I was preaching in Disciple Church this morning at 8:30, and Bill Longsworth, whom some of you all know, great scholar, biblical scholar, he looked over at me and he said, I guess you're preaching from the 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20 text. And I looked at him and I said, well, yes, I am. And I said, what does it say? And he said, and I'm paraphrasing it, but if you read it, it says, in Christ is God's yes. In all situations, as God interacts in the world, in Christ is God's yes. And we all say, so be it. That's how he starts chapter 1 of 2 Corinthians. I thought, wow, okay. That's not the text I was going to talk about, but I just thought that was interesting. So we're going to talk about God's yes and in Jesus, in particular because we're also looking at, the whole church is kind of looking at a series talking about who is this Jesus, Googling Jesus. And I wanted to think about it with you all because I also think with 11:11, we have done some rethinking about all of these old notions that we had in church that many of us grew up with, and rethinking a wider way of understanding what they mean that transforms us into a people of greater hope, but also those with whom we encounter. So we speak of God, we speak of Jesus as the yes and. That's this one-half practice. And I want to acknowledge that part of that yes and is holding both and, holding the reality, the tension of where we are at right now. One of the things I had to learn to hold was my opinion. I had to hold my opinion at bay to make room to hold what I think I'm seeing or what I think I'm understanding at a distance, so that I'm more open to what actually is happening. And where God, Spirit, presence, whatever, might really connect me more with what's possible. And that's challenging to hold the both and, to hold that tension. So, for example, here we are. Some of us have masks on, some of us don't. It's a little different, it's a little strange. I found myself the first day that the CDC said, if you're vaccinated, you don't need a mask. And I thought to myself, I have been so righteously religious about wearing my mask everywhere because I knew how important it was in all situations. And I heard that on the news, and I literally I was going to the bakery to pick up something, and I looked at my mask, and I turned off the car, I looked at my mask, I left it in the car, I went inside the bakery where probably no one had heard that news. And they looked at me like, oh, you're one of them. And I realized that I just had leapt into this place of discomfort with celebration, realizing I was stepping on all sorts of toes in the process. There's this awkwardness that we're in right now. Even as most of us, I'm assuming most of us in here vaccinated, even still we recognize the fragility of the way things are still. And we have to hold that intention. We have to hold the yes and. How do we do that? That's what I think understanding really who Jesus was is about, learning to hold both and in one place. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how difficult that can get. But before I do, I want to tell you a quick story, because I love these kind of stories, and I hope you make the connection of this one as we go along in this. There's a little boy, and he's standing out in front of a house. Nice, big, beautiful home. He's trying to ring the doorbell, and he can't reach it. So he's jumping up there, and he's trying to reach the doorbell. Well, a priest is walking along the road. And the priest sees the boy trying to reach that doorbell. And so he runs up to the little boy and he says, young man, can I help you? And he says, I can't reach the doorbell. And the priest says, all right. And so the priest rings the doorbell. Then he looks at the little boy and he says, now what? And the boy says, run like hell. Okay, it's funny, I know, but there's a connection to it. I get intolerance. I'm going to just say that. I understand intolerance. We have to understand intolerance. We see it in our world, but I get it. I understand how it happens. And as the pastor of the 1111 community over the years, I've experienced how you've experienced intolerance in very personal ways in various church realities that you've experienced in the past. They didn't accept who you were. You felt outcast because of your ideas. You no longer resonated with what was being taught or said. Any number of reasons why we sometimes feel on the fringe of a social setting or group, and we found that in church. And many of you ended up in a place like this that is much more open and questioning and inclusive and inviting. I get that experience of intolerance. But I also understand intolerance from the other side. of what I'm impatient with, of what I find very difficult to live with. And so, I can see it not just in my own experience, but I can see it how we've experienced it historically. And so when I want to talk about Jesus, I can't talk about Jesus. I can't talk about church without acknowledging realistically intolerance. Because so much of what happens that's intolerant in society, somehow you dig deep enough and it's rooted in church. It may not be the church's teaching, but there's enough people in a tribe of intolerant people who have the same orientation to their faith, and it ends up justifying their intolerance. You know what I'm talking about. I'm not striking a new chord here. We can see it on all religions, right? Because we like being right. We like certainty. We don't like ambiguity. We don't like holding contradiction in the same space at the same time. We don't like living with mystery. We want things answered and clear. And even better is when it's comfortable to us, like we know we're right. And so it's hard to understand sometimes the intolerance of others when we can't even see sometimes our own intolerance. I had a friend who told me some time back, but I always remembered this because I didn't grow up in the church, but I had my whole experience where I went from the Baptist. I've told you my story, but basically I went into adolescence into the Baptist church. I had one of those being saved kinds of experiences at the altar. Then I ended up in the Pentecostal church, the Church of Christ. Then I ended up in the Presbyterian church, and then finally in the Methodist church, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. But I remember a friend telling me, he said, and it was because he doesn't go to church anymore. He said, hell is what got me into church. Christians is what got me out. But we understand what he means by that. Religious traditions have a very rigid orientation sometimes. Certainly not all, and we certainly can't put them all in one bag. We are practicing our own intolerance when we do that. But beheadings, crusades, inquisitions, manifest destiny, racism, the Tulsa massacre, how much of our life, the siege on the Capitol, how much of what happens in the world is justified by faith, is justified by the religious roots that are behind that tribe, or underneath that tribe. We understand where intolerance can lead. So what I want to suggest is that we understand where certainty can lead, and hear this, where certainty can lead, but where we've also abandoned reason. Our longing for certainty, and this is true on whatever side we find ourselves, people, our longing for certainty often results in the abandonment of reason. So there's a wonderful parable. Y'all know this. Some of y'all know this, maybe not all of you, but I'm going to do the abbreviated version. A number of blind people, 3 blind people, were asked to describe to a ruler in the ancient Near East, to describe to a ruler what an elephant is like. But they're blind, and so they come in, and he says, "You're all very wise, but I want you to tell for me then what you experience here." So they went up to the elephant, right? And one of them felt the leg, and another one felt the tail, and another one felt the ear. And so he asked them what they found. What is an elephant like? What is an elephant exactly? Can you define an elephant? And they said, yes, an elephant is a fan. The one who felt the ear said, an elephant is a fan. The one who felt the tail says, well, I'm guessing an elephant is a kind of snake. The one who felt the leg said, well, I suppose an elephant is a kind of structure or maybe a tree. And of course, none of them were right, but none of them were wrong. The challenge is seeing something from a wider perspective. Regardless of where we are, it's the challenge, the yes and. It's the one half. It's the what do I not know. It's the way my uncle used to say it when he said when we were out hunting or we were out doing wildlife stuff when we were kids with him, and he'd say, you won't see something because we were complaining. We don't see it. Where's the fox? I don't see a fox. And he would say, you won't see something for what it is as long as you're looking at it for what you think you're seeing. I need to say that again. You won't see a thing for what it is as long as you're looking at it thinking you know what you're seeing. And that's what we do all the time. We always look at something thinking we know what we're seeing. I can't tell you how many times I'll look out in a congregation and I'll look at some people who are kind of looking at me with a little bit of a scowl, or maybe they're kind of looking at me with a frown, or maybe they're yawning, or maybe they just seem nervous and anxious, and I'm going like, oh no, I've stepped on toes. Oh no, they hate what I'm saying. I make all these judgments that are so far removed from reality. And I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's not my business to interpret what you think of me. I'm just going to get off track if I do that. My business is to be open to what I don't know and to be present to that in all my encounters. Maya Angelou had this wonderful saying where she said, "It's always strange to me when people come up and say that they're a Christian. They ask me if I am, and they say they're a Christian." And she says, and I always want to respond with, "Already? Do you get that? What does it mean to be a Christian? To have these certain beliefs that I have, that's what it means. We want certainty. We want to know exactly what we can rely on, and so we lean on that certainty, and where we don't recognize is what we're missing and what we're intolerantly communicating and missing about God in the midst of those encounters because of that. I was at the Wild Goose Festival. The Wild Goose Festival is this wonderful festival that happens in Asheville. It skipped last year, but it's a big sort of hippie tent festival of 30-somethings and 40-somethings and a few of us folks on either end of the spectrum from all walks of life, most of whom are what I would call evangelical refugees. They people who have felt ostracized or marginalized by their church experience, and they find themselves at this festival. And then there's speakers and there's music and it's outdoors and it's a fun thing. One afternoon at the end of the festival, I was sitting with a number of Christian writers. People like Peter Enns, Brian McLaren, Rob Bell, I can't remember her name now, Rachel Evans was there, Diana Butler Bass, all these pretty well-known people who were kind of part of that refugeeism from the evangelical church. And they were all gathered with about 60 other people, participants. And the topic was, what next for Christianity? Right? What's next for Christianity? Should there be Christianity anymore? Right? So almost like I was listening to Nietzsche, the philosopher back in the 60s, going like, God is dead. And everybody going like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he just said that. And none of them realizing what he was saying. Right? Because we're certain. So I was listening around the circle as different people were giving their opinion on what should happen. And most of them really were just telling their story of how they had felt outcast, or how they felt ostracized, or felt no longer a part of the community because of who they were, or how they were, or what they were, or how they thought. And so as it's going around, this woman who's sitting kind of close to me, she's in her 40s, and she says, but I love the church. And I love the hymnody, and I love the traditional rituals. And you could see how fragile it felt to her, because this group was ready to like chuck the whole thing and go, we just need to be something else. They were just, because their experience was pain, right? And this woman was saying, but I get that, but I love the church. I want to see the church continue. And I have these friends, she said, who say they won't believe in Jesus because they hate the church and what it represents. They won't believe in Jesus. That's what that represents to them. And I looked at her and I said, well, what do they do? They're your friends. And she said, well, they are, and they know how much I love it, but they're not going to have any part of it. And I said, well, what do they do? She says, well, one of them is a social worker and works with housing issues. Another one is a drug abuse counselor, substance abuse counselor, and works with addicts. And I said, and they don't want to have any part of Jesus. And she says, that's right. And I said, then you need to tell them to stop acting like him. You see what I'm saying? Already our definition of what is church and what is following Jesus and what it means to be a Christian is too narrow. There's so many Muslims that are doing a better job of being Christians than Christians. True. There's there's so many atheists who are better at following Jesus than people who say, Lord, Lord, on Sunday mornings, right? I mean, the definitions are so much, we need to broaden and widen our understanding of what it means. We need to understand this yes and that's being offered to us. When Linda and I were first in seminary. And I was a Calvinist. And if any of you are Presbyterian Calvinists, you know I knew that what I was doing was foreordained by God, and I better damn well do what I was doing because it's foreordained by God. That's confusing in itself. But I knew that. And then I was going to seminary where a lot of my ideas were being questioned. I was questioning a lot of my understanding. I was already on that journey, but I'd begun to really deconstruct things. And Linda grew up Methodist, right? So she had this very progressive, kind of open understanding. You know, the thing that's been the characteristic of Methodism, at least at its roots, was this idea that you could come from disparate traditions and you find a happy place in the middle, right? So you have a lot of Catholics marrying Baptists and they go to church at the Methodist church because of that extremity, but they find a happy meeting ground sort of in the place where John Wesley, was all about looking at wider influences for who he was as a Christian. I'll get into that in a second, but that's where Linda was. So we heard this wonderful speaker. Some of you would remember him. His name was Gil Farrell. Gil Farrell was a Methodist preacher. He was at Polytech United Methodist. He was an activist in so many great causes and so many marginalized people's needs over the years. He'd find himself in the protest movements. He'd find himself in jail on occasion. He'd find himself speaking out for those on the margins. He was a passionate storyteller. He was a passionate Methodist. And he was a passionate Christian in the best sense of the word. And so he was telling us in our class, because he taught Methodism for the seminary, and so he was telling us in this class talking about this. And then he started sharing this story about his son, Joel. Some of you know Joel. Joel Farrell is an amazing director and playwright and actor in the DFW area and has toured all around and acted in different places. He's also gay. In that day and time, in the late 70s, early 80s, it was difficult to be gay. It's difficult now to be gay, to be trans, to be in this place of what seems unfamiliar and where others are looking for certainty. It seems there's always these challenges that we're being invited to open up to understand. And Gil said the church that he had pastored wouldn't understand it. He said, as much as I taught it, as much as I preached to it, I couldn't get my congregation to accept it. Still a partial group of them wouldn't accept it. He said, that's changing in time, but it's still not changing fast enough. And of course, here we are in the Methodist Church, and First United Methodist Church, a declared inclusive community. 1111 very much has always been a very inclusive community. But the church is still figuring out how it's going to split, right? We're still trying to figure that out. So I'm aware of that because it's Pride Week. But I'm also thinking in terms of how Gil Farrell once told us this, and he said, the reality is that the table is really large, and that anybody can sit at the table. All you have to do is to set aside your opinions and listen to one another. And he said, you don't listen for what you know. You don't listen for what you disagree with. You listen for what you don't know. And he said, if you'll sit and you'll listen to what you don't know, you'll find out that you knew it deeper down, that you both knew it deep down, what's connective, what we celebrate together, what calls us to be one people. But to do that, he said, you have to sit at the table. He said, that's why it's called the welcome table. And then he started singing that old song. I want to sit at the welcome table one of these days, oh Lord. I'm not getting it quite right, but you know. He started singing that, and I mean, we were students, but we were all crying, you know, we all teary-eyed, trying to make sense of all of this. When Jesus went to the cross, right, when he was tried and about to be crucified, the last teaching he gave his disciples, the simplest teaching he said was the parable of the goats and the sheep, right? And he said, the child of the future, the child of the kingdom of heaven, the child of the world, the child of cosmos, the child of the kingdom will come. And when the child comes back and then is ready to reign in this kingdom, the child is going to look to the right and to the left and see the goat and the sheep. And when the child looks to the when the child looks to the sheep, he's going to say, you're welcome, come on in. You fed you fed me, you clothed me, you visited me when I was in prison. You helped me when I was poor, you clothed me when I was naked. He says, come on into the kingdom. And then he'll look to the goats who didn't do that. Well, the sheep will look at him and say, when did we ever do that? We never saw you. You were gone. We didn't see you. How could we have done that? And he said, whenever you did this to those who were hungry, whenever you did that to those who were poor, whenever you did that to those who were in prison, whenever you did that to those who were in need, you did it to me. He said, to the least of these, you did it to me. And when you didn't, well, then you didn't. But I find it interesting that he says, come into the kingdom, because what is the kingdom? It's already here. It's already present, right? So the yes and is already present. The only way it can become it can become real, it can begin to happen, is as we begin to let go of our own assumptions and let go of our own certainties and begin to practice that yes and, to begin to look beyond. So to just finalize and sum up, the band, I think, are going to come over here to the side and get ready. But just to sum up a couple of quick things. I used to always tell this story about the difference between heaven and hell, and it never occurred to me what I was missing. You know how sometimes you'd always tell something, and if you're really paying attention to what you're saying, after a while you just stop telling it? You're going like, there's something there that I don't get. There's something there that I'm telling it, but I don't feel it. I'm not sure what it is I'm missing. So I used to tell this story all the time, and whenever I would tell it at festivals, people would come up afterwards and they'd want to talk about their spirituality, or they'd want to talk about some social issue that they were facing. It's the story of the difference between heaven and hell. And you remember the story, the child asked the rabbi, what's the difference between heaven and hell? And the rabbi says, well, see if you can envision this. In hell, there's a big table. It's a long table. People are seated all around the table. There's delicious food set in front of them. Their mouths are watering. Their arms are locked at the elbows. In hell, the people try to feed themselves, and the food's dropping all over the place. It just falls on the floor. They can't feed themselves. They get more and more angry. They're never satisfied. She said, all right, that sounds like hell. What's heaven like? He says, use your imagination. He says, in heaven, there's a big, long table. He says, a big, wide table, people seated all around it, delicious food from all over the place, the most enticing aromas. Their arms are locked at the elbows. She says, sounds like the same place. He says, no, if you look closely, they're reaching across and feeding each other. And I used to tell that story, and people would go, oh, yeah, the difference is the people. But then I realized something thinking about this story this week. There's something else the rabbi could ask her to look more closely. What's really going on there? What's the yes and? It's the sudden realization that when you look at that other person, you no longer see them, you see yourself. And when we begin to do that, we begin to open up the possibilities that can happen with yes and. Amen.